The text my mother-in-law sent me at 6:47 in the morning was only 9 words long. Son, why did your wife give us keys to some old shed? I read it 3 times while sitting on the edge of our bed, still in my scrubs from the night before, a half-eaten granola bar on the nightstand beside me. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I just felt this slow, cold settling in my chest, the kind you get when something you already suspected deep down finally gets confirmed out loud. I knew exactly which shed they were standing in front of, and I knew exactly why my husband's face, in the photo Diane sent a minute later, looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't solid at all. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the part that came before it. My name is Callie Marsh. I'm 27 years old, and I'm a dentist in Harlow Creek, Tennessee, population just under 11,000, 1 traffic light on Main Street, a Dairy Queen that's been under new management for 6 consecutive years, and approximately 0 secrets that stay secret for longer than a week. I grew up 2 towns over, moved here for a residency position at a small private practice, and ended up staying because the cost of living made sense on a new dentist's salary, and because I genuinely liked the quiet. I met Trevor Marsh, born Trevor Aldridge. He took my last name, a fact his mother has never fully forgiven either of us for, at a mutual friend's cookout in the summer 2 years ago. He was standing by the grill holding a paper plate and looking slightly lost, which turned out to be accurate. He'd driven 40 minutes to the wrong address and had only ended up at the right party by accident. We talked for 4 hours. He called me the next morning. We were engaged 11 months later and married the following April, just the 2 of us at the county clerk's office, followed by dinner at the Italian place on Route 9 that everyone in Harlow Creek considers fancy because they have cloth napkins. Trevor works remotely as a data analyst for a logistics company out of Nashville. He is methodical, gentle, and constitutionally incapable of throwing away junk mail without reading every single word of it first. We don't have any pets. We rent a small 2-bedroom house on Birchwood Lane that sits next to a drainage ditch that smells like mud and old leaves every time it rains, which in Tennessee is constantly. Our marriage, for the first 1.5 years, was genuinely good. Not Instagram good, real good. The kind where you bicker about who forgot to buy dish soap and then laugh about it 20 minutes later. The kind where you know each other's coffee orders and which podcast the other person falls asleep to. I worked long hours. Trevor cooked dinner most nights because my schedule was unpredictable, and his was not. We were saving money carefully, building something that felt like it had a real foundation under it. Trevor's parents, Dennis and Diane Aldridge, live about 3 hours north of us, outside of Knoxville. Dennis is retired, former HVAC installer, quiet in the way of men who spent 30 years working with their hands and don't feel the need to fill silence. Diane is a different story entirely. She's the kind of woman who asks questions that are actually statements, who sends articles about topics you didn't ask about, who has a particular tone of voice she reserves for moments when she disapproves of something, but wants you to know she's being gracious about it. She never approved of me. I understood that early. It wasn't anything she said directly. It was the pauses, the way she'd look at Trevor when I talked about work, like she was silently calculating whether a wife who spent 45 hours a week looking into people's mouths was really the best use of her son's future. She'd wanted him to marry a woman named Stacy from their church who sold real estate and brought homemade banana bread to every family gathering. Stacy was sweet. I'd met her twice at Aldridge family events. I didn't dislike her. But I was the one Trevor married, and Diane had been quietly processing that information for the entire 2 years of our marriage. Then there was Renee. Renee is Trevor's younger sister by 4 years. She's 23, lives 30 minutes from us in a rental apartment in Clover Mill, and has what I can only describe as a very specific talent for making every room she enters feel slightly more complicated than it was before she arrived. She and Trevor are close, in the way that siblings are close when one of them has always been the favorite, without anyone officially saying so. She has their mother's eyes, and their mother's habit of asking questions shaped like compliments. When Trevor and I got married, Renee was a bridesmaid, or she would have been if we'd had a wedding. Since we didn't, she was instead the person who organized our small celebratory dinner and ordered a cake that said "Finally" on it, in blue frosting, which everyone thought was funny and which I thought was interesting. Renee and I were never enemies. We were never close either. We existed in the polite, carefully managed middle distance that a lot of women maintain with their sisters-in-law. Cordial texts, holiday dinners, the occasional comment on each other's social media that doesn't mean very much. I want to be honest here. I had no reason to suspect her, not a single alarm bell, not one moment where I looked at Renee and thought, this person is going to try to take something from me. That's the part that still gets me when I turn it over in my head at night. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone I'd already identified as a threat. It was the woman who sat across from me at Thanksgiving and asked me what my favorite local hiking trail was, who sent me a birthday text in March with a string of balloon emojis, who once borrowed my car charger and actually returned it. The first thing I noticed, the very first crack in the surface, happened on a Tuesday evening in early July. The air outside was the kind of thick, heavy July heat that Harlow Creek does particularly well, the kind where stepping outside at 8 in the evening still feels like walking into a warm, wet towel. I'd had a long day at the practice, a crown prep that ran over, a kid who'd cried through his entire cleaning, an emergency extraction at 4:30 that pushed everything back by an hour. I came home tired in a specific way that only other dentists probably understand. Not just physically tired, but tired in your hands, tired in your jaw from clenching it in concentration for 8 hours straight. Trevor was at the kitchen table with his laptop open, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he closed it when I walked in. Not quickly, not like he was hiding something obvious, just a small, smooth motion, like closing a book at a natural stopping point. I almost didn't notice. I noticed. "Long day?" he asked. "Very," I said. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the counter for a moment. "What were you working on?" "Just some projections for the quarterly report," he said. "Nothing interesting." I nodded. I didn't push. That's the thing about being tired. It knows you less precise, less sharp, less inclined to follow a thread just because something about it feels slightly off. I ate dinner, took a shower, and went to bed. I told myself it was nothing. I was good at telling myself things were nothing back then. 2 days later, I got a call from a notary in our county named Patricia Hewitt. She left a voicemail while I was mid-procedure, so I didn't hear it until my lunch break. Her voice was professional and careful, the voice of someone who deals regularly with situations that require a certain degree of delicacy. "Ms. Marsh," she said, "this is Patricia Hewitt from Hewitt Notary Services on Cedar Road. I'm following up on a document that was filed through our office last week. There are a few details I need to clarify with you directly. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." I sat in my car in the parking lot behind the practice and listened to that message twice. My lunch was a granola bar and a bottle of iced tea. The granola bar went uneaten. I stared at Patricia Hewitt's number on my screen and felt that same slow, cold settling I'd feel again weeks later when Diane's text arrived. I called her back. She answered on the second ring. And what she told me in the next 4 minutes changed every single assumption I'd been operating under for the past 2 years of my life. She told me a document had been filed bearing my signature, a real estate document, a significant one. And the problem, the very specific, very serious problem, was that she had no record of ever meeting me in person to notarize it. Because she hadn't. I had never been in her office. I had never signed anything in front of her. I had never authorized any real estate transaction of any kind in Harlow Creek or anywhere else. Someone had used my name. Someone had signed my signature. And that someone, I didn't know yet, not for certain, not with the kind of proof that matters, had apparently been busy while I was spending my days looking into other people's mouths and my evenings telling myself that everything was fine. I sat in that parking lot for 11 minutes after I hung up with Patricia Hewitt. The heat pressed in through the windshield, and I watched a crow land on the dumpster by the back entrance, and I thought, very clearly for the first time, something is very wrong, and has been wrong for a while, and I am only just now being allowed to see the edge of it. I didn't call Trevor. I wasn't sure yet why I didn't, but I didn't. I went back inside and finished my afternoon appointments and told exactly no one what I'd just learned. I smiled at patients. I explained proper flossing technique. I scheduled a follow-up for a woman with early-stage gum disease and told her she was doing great, which was true. And on the drive home that evening, I made a decision. I wasn't going to react yet. I was going to find out what had actually been signed, in whose name, for what property, and why. I was going to do this quietly and carefully, and before I confronted anyone about anything, I was going to know exactly what I was dealing with. I just didn't know yet how deep it went. The County Property Records Office on Millbrook Avenue closes at 4:30 on weekdays and isn't open on Saturdays at all, which meant I had approximately 2 business days before the weekend to figure out what had been filed and in whose name before I said a single word to Trevor. I used my lunch break the next day to drive there. I told my receptionist, Gwen, that I had a personal errand and would be back by 1. Gwen has worked at the practice longer than I have and asks no follow-up questions, which is one of her most valuable qualities. The records office smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper. A man behind the counter named Roy, his name tag said Roy, no last name, just Roy, pulled up the filing in about 4 minutes once I gave him my name and date of birth. He turned the monitor slightly so I could see it, which I appreciated. The document was a deed transfer. A property on Sycamore Hollow Road, out past the edge of Harlow Creek proper, had been transferred into my name approximately 3 weeks earlier. The property was described as a 1.4-acre parcel with a residential structure. The purchase price listed was $218,000. The notary of record was Patricia Hewitt. My signature was on the document, in a place I could see clearly on the scanned copy Roy printed for me, and it looked enough like my actual signature that I understood, in a cold and clinical way, why no one had flagged it. I stood at the counter and looked at that piece of paper for a long moment. Roy didn't rush me. He had the quiet patience of someone who has seen people receive bad news at his counter before, and knows there's nothing useful he can add. "Who filed this?" I asked. "Filing party listed is a Renee Aldridge," he said. "Is there anything else you need printed out?" I took the document. I drove back to the practice. I told Gwen I was going to eat my lunch in my car and asked her to push my 1 o'clock back 15 minutes. Then I sat in the parking lot and staring at the name Renee Aldridge on the printout until the letters stopped looking like letters and started looking like something else entirely. Here is what I understood by the time I went back inside. Renee had forged my signature on a deed transfer. She had purchased a property, or transferred one, the specifics still weren't clear, using my identity. She had done this without my knowledge, without my consent, and apparently without anyone in the notary's office or the county clerk's office asking enough questions to catch it. And Trevor, I didn't know yet whether Trevor knew. That was the part that sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. That evening, I watched my husband make pasta at our stove. He was humming something low under his breath, the way he does when he's in a good mood. He'd set the table already, poured 2 glasses of water, left a small bunch of basil on the cutting board that he must have picked up at the grocery store because we didn't grow any. He looked entirely ordinary. He looked like a man who had no idea what his wife had found out that afternoon, or like a man who was very good at looking that way. I genuinely could not tell which one it was, and that uncertainty was its own kind of suffering. I smiled through dinner. I asked about his day. I listened to him talk about a data migration issue his team was dealing with, and I made the appropriate sounds of sympathy, and I did not say one word about Sycamore Hollow Road. I went to bed before he did, which wasn't unusual. I lay there in the dark, listening to him move around the house, the refrigerator opening and closing, the bathroom faucet running, the specific creak of the 3rd floorboard from the left in the hallway that I'd been meaning to mention to our landlord for 8 months. Normal sounds, house sounds, the sounds of a life that 24 hours ago I had believed was solid. I didn't sleep. I lay there and thought about Renee's face at Thanksgiving. I thought about the balloon emoji birthday text. I thought about the car charger she'd borrowed and returned. I thought about the fact that she knew my full legal name, my date of birth, my address, all of it, because she was family, because I had never thought to protect myself from family. And then I thought about the $218,000, where it had gone, who had paid it, whether it was even real money or some kind of shell transaction I didn't yet have the vocabulary to understand. By 3 a.m, I had made a list on my phone of every question I needed to answer before I did anything else. It had 11 items on it. The last one said simply, "Does Trevor know?" I stared at that question for a while. Then I turned my phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling instead, because there was no answer available to me at 3 a.m, and staring at the question wasn't making one appear. The lowest point came 3 days later, and it didn't arrive in the dramatic way I might have expected. There was no confrontation, no shouting, no moment where someone said something unforgivable across a kitchen table. It was quieter than that, and in some ways, that made it worse. I had called Patricia Hewitt back to ask her directly what she remembered about the signing. She was careful, clearly aware that she was potentially in a difficult position herself. But she told me what she could. A woman had come into her office with a Tennessee driver's license bearing my name and photo. Not my photo, a photo of someone who resembled me closely enough to pass a brief visual check. The woman had signed, paid the notarization fee in cash, and left. Patricia had been doing this job for 19 years. She had not caught it. She sounded genuinely shaken by that, and I believed her, and I felt almost sorry for her, which was an odd thing to feel when I was the one whose identity had been stolen. "The woman who came in," I said carefully. "Can you describe her?" Patricia paused. "Dark hair, medium height, young, mid-20s maybe. She had on a green jacket. I remember that specifically because I'd been looking at a similar one online. Renee has dark hair. Renee is 23. I don't know what jacket she owns, because I have never paid that close attention to Renee's wardrobe, and I felt a sudden, fierce shame at that, at how little I had been paying attention, at how thoroughly I had been living inside the assumption that the people around me were who they appeared to be. That night, Trevor got a phone call after dinner. He stepped out onto the back porch to take it. I watched him through the kitchen window while I washed the dishes, not spying, just doing dishes, but watching. And I saw his posture change partway through the call. His shoulders dropped. He turned slightly away from the window. When he came back inside 10 minutes later, he said it had been his buddy from college, some question about fantasy football. I nodded. I said something about the draft. I finished drawing the last bowl and put it in the cabinet and thought, that was not a fantasy football call. I did not know yet what it was, but I knew what it wasn't. I cried in the shower the next morning, the specific controlled kind of crying you do when you know you can't afford to fall apart, when you need to be functional in 45 minutes and you're giving yourself exactly this window to feel the full weight of what's happening. I pressed my forehead against the tile and let the hot water run, and I thought about the fact that I had married this man at the county clerk's office and eaten dinner at the Italian place with the cloth napkins and built something I thought was real. And now I was standing in my own shower crying because I didn't know if my husband was complicit in his sister stealing my identity or just a man who didn't know and was going to be devastated when he found out, and I couldn't tell the difference. And not being able to tell the difference might have been the worst part of all of it. I turned the water off. I got dressed. I drove to work. The turn came from a direction I hadn't anticipated, which is almost always how turns come. Gwen has a sister named Patrice who works as a paralegal for a firm in Knoxville that handles real estate litigation. I did not know this. I had worked with Gwen for over a year, and somehow the subject of Patrice had never come up in any useful way. But on the Thursday after my shower breakdown, Gwen noticed that I had been quieter than usual for several days running, and she waited until the last patient of the afternoon had left, and then she came and stood in the doorway of my office and said, "I don't want to overstep, but you look like someone who's carrying something heavy, and I know what that looks like because I've looked that way before." I don't know exactly why I told her. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of keeping it contained. Maybe it was that she asked directly, without performing concern, without making it about herself. I gave her the outline, the forged document, the property on Sycamore Hoff Road, the notary who had no memory of meeting me. Gwen listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. Then she said, "My sister handles exactly this kind of thing, fraudulent real estate transfers. She's seen it before, and she'll know what your first move should be before you talk to anyone else." She paused. "Including your husband." That last part landed with precision. Gwen was not a person who wasted words. I called Patrice that evening from my car, parked in the lot behind the Harlow Creek Public Library, where I was unlikely to be recognized or overheard. Patrice's voice was brisk and clear, the voice of someone who processes complicated information for a living and finds comfort in getting to the practical quickly. "Before you confront anyone," she said, "you need 3 things. A certified copy of that deed from the county recorder, the actual certified copy, not just the printout. A written statement from the notary acknowledging she never physically verified your identity, and a police report filed with your name as the victim of identity fraud. Those 3 things create a paper trail that protects you, no matter what happens next, whether this ends in a civil suit, a criminal complaint, or a divorce proceeding." That was the first time I'd heard the word divorce spoken out loud in relation to my own life. It hit me somewhere behind my sternum, blunt and exact. I didn't say anything for a moment. "You okay?" Patrice asked. "I'm fine," I said. "Keep going. The property itself," she continued, "if it was transferred into your name using a forged signature, you may actually hold legal title to it right now, which is either useful or complicated, depending on what was done with it afterward. Do you know anything about the property itself? What's on it?" "The county records said a residential structure," I said, "on Sycamore Hollow Road." "Have you been out there?" I hadn't. The thought of going out there alone, to a piece of property I technically owned and had never seen, felt strange in a way I couldn't fully articulate. But Patrice said, neutrally and practically, that it might be worth understanding exactly what I was dealing with before I let anyone else define it for me. So the following Saturday morning, while Trevor was on a call with his team in Nashville, I drove out to Sycamore Hollow Road with the printed coordinates from the county record and a thermos of coffee and the specific, sharpened calm of a person who has decided to stop being afraid of what they're going to find. The property was at the end of a gravel drive, set back from the road, behind a stand of cedar trees that were tall enough to block it entirely from the road. I wouldn't have found it without the coordinates. I parked on the gravel and got out and stood there for a moment in the early August heat, looking at what was in front of me. It was not, by any reasonable definition, a luxury lake house with a pool. It was a structure I would have called a large storage building, weathered board and batten siding, a metal roof with a patch of rust at one corner, 2 small windows on the front face, a padlocked door. The cedar trees threw shade over most of it, and the grass around it was knee-high. There was no lake visible from where I stood. There was no pool. There was a rusted metal chair sitting in the weeds near the door, like someone had put it there years ago and then forgotten it entirely. I walked the perimeter. The land itself was beautiful in the way that Tennessee land often is, even when it's completely neglected, rolling slightly toward a tree line at the back, the cedars blocking the road noise. A quality of stillness that in other circumstances would have felt peaceful. On the east side of the structure, half hidden by overgrowth, there was a second door, smaller, newer-looking, with a different padlock, and tucked under the edge of the metal roof, just above that door, barely visible unless you were standing right in front of it and looking up, was the small white rectangle of a security camera. Active. The small red indicator light was on. I stood there looking at that blinking red light for a long moment, the August heat pressing down through the cedar branches, and I felt something shift inside me. Not fear exactly, but a kind of focused clarity. The same thing that happens when a patient comes in with something I initially can't place, and then suddenly the image resolves, and I know exactly what I'm looking at. Someone was watching this property. Someone had set up a camera and was monitoring it, which meant someone expected this place to matter. I took 3 photos of the camera with my phone, the lens, the mounting bracket, the small power wire running down the siding toward what looked like a solar panel tucked behind the building. Then I walked back to my car, drove to the end of Sycamore Hollow Road, and sat there with the engine running and the air conditioning on full blast, and I called Patrice. "There's a security camera," I said. "Active. Someone's watching the structure." Patrice was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Don't go back there alone, and don't touch anything. If this property is in your name via a forged deed, you technically have a right to be on it, but I don't want you anywhere near it before we understand who else thinks they have a claim." She told me the next step was filing the police report that day, not tomorrow, not after I'd talked to Trevor, that afternoon. She also said she'd already spoken to an attorney at her firm named Marcus Webb, who handled criminal real estate fraud, and that he'd agreed to take a call with me Monday morning at 9. I filed the report at the Harlow Creek Police Station at 4:15 that Friday afternoon. The officer who took my statement was named Deputy Harlan Cole, who was maybe 40, unhurried, and wrote everything down in longhand in a green spiral notebook. He asked me to repeat the name of the filing party twice. When I said Renee Aldridge the second time, I felt the weight of it differently than I had at Roy's counter, because now it was official. Now it was in a notebook. Now it existed in a way that couldn't be quietly folded up and put away. "Any idea why she might have done this?" Deputy Cole asked. "Not yet," I said, "but I intend to find out." The weekend was the longest of my life. I went home, made dinner, watched Trevor watch television, and did not say a single word about any of it. On Sunday morning, he suggested we drive out to the lake, and I said I had some continuing education modules to finish online, which was not entirely a lie because I do have ongoing CE requirements, and I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I thought about the camera and the padlocked doors and the $218,000 and the green jacket Patricia Hewitt remembered. Monday morning at 9, I was in my car in the library parking lot with my phone on speaker. Marcus Webb's voice was direct and unhurried, the voice of a man who has heard many variations of this particular story and finds none of them surprising anymore. "The forged deed transfers title into your name," he said, "which means you are technically the property owner of record. What that also means is that if someone intended to use that property as collateral for anything, a loan, another transaction, they needed your name on it, and then they would need you to sign again, this time in person and legitimately, to complete the next step. My guess is this is a first move, not the whole game. Someone is building towards something." "What would the next step be?" I asked. "A refinance, a home equity line of credit, or the property gets sold, and suddenly there's a real estate transaction with your name as seller, and someone pockets the proceeds." He paused. "Do you have any reason to believe the subject, Renee Aldridge, is experiencing financial difficulty?" I thought about Renee's apartment in Clover Mill, the way she'd mentioned once, offhandedly, at a holiday dinner, that her car needed a repair she was putting off, the way she'd asked Trevor, also offhandedly, whether the practice I worked at offered employee dental benefits she could maybe get added onto as a family member, which wasn't how any of that worked, and which Trevor had gently explained. "Possibly," I said. "Find out what you can," Marcus said, quietly. "Don't confront her yet. Don't confront your husband yet. Give me until Wednesday and I'll have a clearer picture of what's been recorded against this property." I gave him until Wednesday, and on Wednesday afternoon, he called me back with something I hadn't anticipated. The property on Sycamore Hollow Road had been listed, 3 weeks earlier, on a private real estate platform, not the MLS, something smaller and less regulated, as a luxury lake house with a pool, listed at $485,000. The listing used photographs that were not photographs of the actual property. The listing was under my name, and the listing had attracted a buyer who had paid a $15,000 deposit against the full purchase price, with the closing scheduled for the following month. The buyer was Dennis and Diane Aldridge. I sat in my car and read that sentence on the document Marcus had emailed me, and I read it again, and I understood, all at once, the full shape of what Renee had built. She hadn't just forged my signature on a deed. She had constructed an entire false property listing, sold it to her own parents, Trevor's parents, at nearly $500,000, collected a deposit from them, and was planning to collect the rest at closing. She had been stealing from her own family while using my identity as the mechanism. The security camera wasn't someone watching me. It was Renee watching her investment, making sure no one wandered onto the property before she could close the deal and disappear with the money. Dennis and Diane thought they were buying a lake house. They had wired $15,000 to what they believed was an escrow account connected to a legitimate transaction. They were standing in front of a shed in the weeds because someone had sent them the coordinates of the actual parcel, the real property, not the photographed fiction, and they didn't understand yet why what they were looking at bore no resemblance to what they'd been shown. That someone was me. I had sent them those coordinates that morning. I want to explain why, because it matters. By Wednesday evening, I had spoken to Marcus twice more, and to Deputy Cole, and to Patrice, and I understood clearly what was going to happen next. A warrant was being prepared. Marcus had contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit, and they were moving quickly because the amount involved, the full $485,000 purchase price, not just the $15,000 deposit, crossed a threshold that made this a serious felony, not a county-level matter. Renee was going to be arrested. The question was whether she would be arrested before or after she understood that the whole structure had collapsed. I wanted her to know it had collapsed before law enforcement showed up at her door. I wanted her to have one moment of standing in the wreckage of what she'd built and understanding that it hadn't worked, that I had seen it, that I had dismantled it piece by piece, while she thought I was just a dentist in Harlow Creek who didn't pay close attention. That was not noble of me. I'm not going to pretend it was, but it was honest. So I texted Diane the coordinates of the actual property, and then I texted Renee a single message. They're there, so am I. Then I drove to Sycamore Hollow Road. Trevor's parents were standing in the knee-high grass when I pulled up. Dennis had his hands in his pockets and was looking at the structure with the expression of a man doing patient arithmetic. Diane had her phone out and was attempting to reach someone, I assumed Trevor or Renee. She looked up when she heard my tires on the gravel, and her expression cycled through several things quickly: surprise, confusion, and then something harder to name that sat right behind her eyes. "Callie," she said, "what is going on? Trevor sent us the listing for a property that was supposed to be—" "Trevor didn't send you anything," I said. I kept my voice level. I had practiced this in the car. "Renee sent it to you, and the property in the listing doesn't exist. This is the actual property, a storage structure on 1.4 acres, no lake, no pool. You paid $15,000 in a deposit on a transaction that was fraudulent from the beginning." The silence that followed was the specific silence of people whose world has just rearranged itself without permission. Dennis turned to look at me. Diane's hand tightened around her phone. "What are you saying?" Diane said. Not a question, more like a person saying words while their brain catches up. "I'm saying your daughter forged my signature on a real estate document, transferred this property into my name without my knowledge, created a false listing using my identity, and sold it to you. She was going to collect the full purchase price at closing and disappear with the money." I held up the folder Marcus had prepared, the certified deed copy, the notary's written statement, the police report number, the screenshot of the fraudulent listing. "I have documentation for all of it." Dennis took the folder. He opened it. He stood there in the weeds reading, in the slow, thorough way of a man who spent 30 years reading HVAC schematics and knows that detail matters. Diane did not move. "She needed money," Diane said finally, quietly, almost to herself. "She's been in trouble since. She lost her job in the spring. She didn't tell us. She stopped." "I know," I said, and I did by then. Marcus had found the rest of it. Renee had been terminated from her job in April, had run through her savings by June, had found the property on Sycamore Hollow Road through a tax lien listing. It had been abandoned, the previous owner had died without heirs, and had constructed the entire scheme over the course of 6 weeks. The plan was precise in its way. It would have worked if Patricia Hewitt hadn't followed up on the filing. If I had been the kind of person who didn't follow threads just because something felt slightly off. A car pulled onto the gravel behind mine. I had expected it. 2 TBI agents and Deputy Cole got out. I had called Marcus from the road, and he had confirmed the timing. Renee was, at that same moment, being contacted at her apartment in Clover Mill. I learned later, as I always seem to learn things, after the fact, from someone who was there, that she'd opened her door already dressed, with a bag packed, which told its own story about how much faith she'd ultimately had in her own plan. Diane made a sound when she saw Deputy Cole that I will not try to describe because some sounds don't translate into language. Dennis handed the folder back to me. His face was composed in the way of someone who is not going to fall apart in front of other people, who will fall apart later and privately. "I'm sorry," he said. "Callie, I'm sorry this happened to you." It was the most he'd ever said to me directly, in 2 years of dinners and holidays and careful, managed distance. I nodded. I didn't trust myself to say much back. Trevor arrived 20 minutes later, tires loud on the gravel. He'd gotten a call from his mother. I found out later she'd reached him after all, just not in time to change anything. He stepped out of his truck and stood at the edge of the weeds and looked at his parents, at the TBI agents, at me, at the shed. And I watched his face do the same thing his father's had done. The arithmetic, the rearranging, the slow arrival at something true. "Callie," he said. "I know you didn't know," I said, and I did know that by then. Marcus had gone through the phone records connected to the escrow account Renee had set up, and Trevor's name was nowhere in them. The fantasy football call had been Renee. I was almost certain of it. She'd probably told him some partial story, tested how much he knew, and Trevor, being Trevor, had filed it away as something he didn't fully understand and meant to ask about later. That was his weakness, not malice. He trusted his sister in the way you trust someone you grew up with, before you understand that growing up together doesn't make anyone immune to desperation. He looked at the shed for a long time. "She told me she'd found you a great investment property," he said, "that she was helping you surprise me with it. That's what she said." He shook his head. "I thought it was strange that you hadn't mentioned it." "I hadn't mentioned it because I didn't know about it. I know that now." We stood there in the August heat, the two of us, while the TBI agent spoke quietly with his parents, and a mockingbird ran through its whole repertoire in the cedar trees overhead, indifferent to all of it. There were 100 things I could have said. I had rehearsed several of them in the shower, in the parking lot, in the 11 minutes after I hung up with Patricia Hewitt.